Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Share your stories with us. Maybe the next betrayal story will be from your city, and we start. Jason Crow woke up at 6:30 a.m., as usual, to the soft hum of his alarm clock, which he had tuned to the classic NPR station. The sun's rays streamed through the heavy curtains of their suburban Chicago bedroom, drawing streaks of gold across the oak floor. He stretched, feeling a slight ache in his shoulders, a consequence of long hours at the editor's desk in Chicago Herald. He was 48, but he was still in shape. Morning runs around Lincoln Park and occasional sparring sessions in the boxing gym where he once trained in his youth kept his body from relaxing. Today was the big day, the annual charity gala, and Jason knew Elizabeth was already there mentally, planning every detail of her appearance. He turned, expecting to see her nearby, but the bed was empty. The sheets on her side were neatly tucked in, as if she had never gone to bed. Jason frowned, but quickly shrugged off his concern. Elizabeth often got up earlier, especially on days like this. She was vice president of Sterling Press, and her life revolved around meetings, contracts, and endless calls with authors who could even call from London at 3 in the morning. He got used to her rhythm, although sometimes he found himself missing the times when they could spend the morning together, just chatting over coffee. Jason walked downstairs, barefoot on the cool steps of their two-story Oak Park home. The house was their pride, a Victorian mansion with high ceilings, a red brick fireplace and windows that caught the sunset, turning the living room into an impressionist painting. They bought it 10 years ago, after Elizabeth was promoted and Jason became executive editor. Herald. It was a symbol of their success, their common victory. There were photographs on the wall. Nathan in his Yale football uniform, Olivia at her Stanford graduation, and him and Elizabeth in the Tuscan hills, laughing with glasses of Chianti in their hands. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee. Elizabeth was here after all. She stood by the island, scrolling through something on her tablet, her blonde hair pulled back into a high bun, and her business suit from Armani emphasized her slender figure. Even at home, she looked like she was ready to go on stage. Jason smiled as he walked closer. "Good morning, Miss Corporate America," he teased, pouring himself a cup of coffee from her coffee machine, which cost as much as a used motorcycle. Elizabeth looked up, and for a second her eyes sparkled with warmth, but then returned to the screen. "Hello, Jay. Do you remember that there is a gala today? I ordered a tuxedo for you. It's in the dressing room. And please don't wear those awful eagle cufflinks Mark gave you." Jason chuckled. Mark Reynolds, his best friend and lawyer, had a habit of gifting ridiculous items that Jason wore anyway to annoy Elizabeth. The cufflinks remain. This is tradition. She rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched into a smile. "You are unbearable." She put the tablet down and looked at it more closely. "Are you ready for tonight? Half of Chicago will be there, and Marion Clark, my boss. She wants to discuss an idea with you for a column about book publishing." Jason nodded, although he felt slightly irritated inside. Elizabeth always found a way to turn their outings into business meetings, but he got used to it. Her career was her passion, her heir. He was proud of her, even if sometimes he felt more like her business partner than her husband. "I can handle it, Liz." As always, he took a sip of coffee, looking at her over the mug. "Have you already chosen a dress?" Her eyes lit up. "Oh, you have no idea. Black, strapless, with a slit. I tried it yesterday, and let's just say it will impress." Jason felt a warmth in his chest. Elizabeth always knew how to be the star of the evening, and he loved to see her shine. "Then I should practice my smile for social gossip," he joked. She laughed, but the laugh was short, almost mechanical. She turned her attention to the tablet again, and Jason felt the invisible wall between them grow a little thicker. He shrugged off the feeling. Just nerves before the big event, he told himself. After breakfast, Jason went to the office Chicago Herald, which was located in the city center, in a skyscraper overlooking the Chicago River. The newsroom was his kingdom, The smell of fresh paper, the clatter of keyboards, the voices of reporters arguing over headlines. He loved that chaotic energy, that pulse of news that made him feel alive. Over 20 years in journalism, he went from an intern writing notes about local fairs to a man whose word could influence the opinion of the city. His office was modest, a wooden table littered with manuscripts, shelves with books, and a photograph of Elizabeth against the backdrop of the Colosseum. She gave him this frame for their 20th anniversary, with the inscription, "It's us against the world, Jay." Today, he had to approve an editorial about corruption in the mayor's office, but his thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth. Something in her behavior in the morning alarmed him. Maybe it was her gaze too fast, too distant, or the way she had avoided long conversations in recent weeks, citing work. He remembered their last trip to Italy 2 years ago. They walked around Florence holding hands, but even then she was often distracted by her phone, answering letters while he tried to persuade her to try tiramisu in a small trattoria. He then chalked it up to stress, but now these little things add up to a worrying picture. Crow, the voice of his chief reporter, Joe Spencer, pulled him out of his thoughts. Joe burst into the office with a laptop. "We have evidence in the bribery case. The mayor is in deep shit. Will you give the green light for publication?" Jason leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to concentrate. "Show me what you have." He spent the next 2 hours immersed in work, sorting through documents and editing text. But even in this whirlwind, his thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth. He remembered how she once admitted that she sometimes felt trapped in their perfect life. "We're like characters in a commercial, Jay," she said, laughing, but there was bitterness in her voice. "It's all too right." He then shrugged it off, deciding that it was just fatigue. Now he regretted not asking what she meant. By lunchtime, Jason decided to call Nathan. His son was at Yale studying for his international law exams, but he always made time for his father. Jason dialed the number, and after the third ring, he heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Dad, how are you?" Nathan sounded cheerful, but voices and laughter could be heard in the background. "I'm in the library, but it looks more like a party here." Jason smiled. "Don't be distracted from your studies, son. Just wanted to check how you are. And, did you talk to your mom this week?" Nathan hesitated. Yes, a couple of days ago. She was busy as usual. I asked about Emma, my girlfriend, and what? Nothing," Jason lied. "I just miss you. Fly over for the weekend if you can." "I'll try, Dad." "Hey, are you going to the gala tonight? Mom said it would be great." "Yes," Jason answered, feeling something tighten in his chest. "Grandiose." They said goodbye and Jason stared at the phone. He wanted to call Olivia, but changed his mind. His daughter was too perceptive, and he didn't want her to notice his anxiety. Instead, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the old notebook where he had kept notes from his and Elizabeth's youth. There were stupid lists. What to take to Paris, anniversary ideas, even why I love Liz. He wrote this list after their first fight, when she went to her parents for a week, leaving him in their tiny apartment in Boston. Then he thought he would lose her. Now he was afraid that this feeling would return. The day flew by in a flurry, and by 6 in the evening Jason returned home to prepare for the gala evening. Elizabeth was already in the bedroom, surrounded by a makeup artist and a stylist. She stood in front of the mirror, trying on the diamond necklace he had given her for her 25th wedding anniversary. It cost him 3 months' salary, but her smile was worth more than any money back then. "You're late," she said, without looking up from the mirror. "The limousine will be there in an hour." "I'll make it," Jason answered, heading to the bathroom. He turned on the shower, letting the hot streams wash away his fatigue. Standing underwater, he tried to remember the last time he and Elizabeth had spoken for real. Not about work, not about children, not about bills about themselves. He couldn't find the answer, and it was scary. When he came out, already in a tuxedo, Elizabeth was ready. She looked like a movie star. The black dress hugged her figure, highlighting every curve, and the slit at the thigh added a hint of sass. Her blonde hair was styled in an elegant bun, exposing her neck where her necklace sparkled. Jason froze, amazed by her beauty. "Well, how?" she asked, turning to him with a slight smile. "You are incredible," he said sincerely. "I'm a happy person, Liz." She looked at him, and for a moment her gaze softened. "Thank you, Jay." But then she turned away, checking her purse. "Let's go, I don't want to be late." The limousine rushed them through the evening Chicago, the lights of skyscrapers reflected in the windows. Jason looked at Elizabeth, who was scrolling through messages on her phone. He wanted to take her hand, but something stopped him. Instead, he asked, "Are you okay? You're kind of distant." She looked up, and her smile was too fast, too rehearsed. "Everything is fine, Jay. Just a lot of work. You know how it goes." He nodded, but there was a growing feeling inside that he was missing something important. They arrived at the Hotel Drake, where the gala evening took place. The paparazzi were already waiting at the entrance, their flashes blinding. Elizabeth walked out first, smiling confidently at the photographers, and Jason followed, feeling more like her companion than her equal. Inside, the room was full as Chicago's elite, from politicians to real estate tycoons, mingled to the sounds of jazz. Elizabeth was immediately the center of attention, her laughter ringing like a bell as she greeted her colleagues. Jason took a glass of whiskey, watching her from the side. She was in her element, and he loved her for it. But deep down, he felt out of place. He noticed a man who was looking at Elizabeth a little longer than he should have. Tall, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that promised trouble. Jason clutched his glass, but forced himself to look away. It was just an evening, just another social event. It's okay. Hotel Hall Drake shone like a jewel under the crystal chandeliers that cast thousands of sparks onto the marble floor. A charity gala for a children's foundation brought out the cream of Chicago. Senators in sharp tuxedos, their wives in couture dresses, real estate moguls whose names flashed in the headlines Forbes, and journalists like Jason Crow, who watched the circus with a glass in hand and a slight grin. A live jazz quartet played something soft, almost hypnotic, mixing with the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses. It was an evening where everyone wanted to be noticed, and Elizabeth Crow, as always, was the center of attention. She stood 10 steps away from Jason, her black strapless dress flowing over her figure like liquid obsidian, emphasizing the graceful line of her shoulders and thin waist. The diamond necklace, Jason's gift for their 25th wedding anniversary, sparkled around her neck, catching the light and drawing her gaze. Her blonde hair, styled in an elegant bun, showed off her neck, and Jason found himself thinking that even after 27 years of marriage, she still made his heart beat a little faster. He stood at the bar, holding a glass of bourbon, and looked at her with pride mixed with something else, a shadow of anxiety that he could not yet name. Elizabeth was talking to Marion Clark, her boss from Sterling Press, and a couple of other guests, men in expensive suits, whose smiles were too polished. She laughed, lightly touching the elbow of one of them, her movements smooth, almost theatrical. Jason knew this dance of hers. She knew how to charm, turn business conversations into a game where everyone felt special. It was her superpower, and he loved her for it. But today her laughter sounded different, a little louder, a little longer than usual. Or was it just his imagination? He took a sip of bourbon, feeling the warmth spread through his chest, and tried to push away the strange thoughts. It was just an evening, another social event, where they played their roles. He is a respected editor, Chicago Herald. She is a star in the publishing world. They were a team, always have been. But when he looked at Elizabeth again, his gaze caught on a new player in this performance. The man stood too close to her, closer than decency allowed. Tall, with perfectly coiffed dark hair and a polished smile, he looked like a man who knew all eyes were on him. His tailored suit fit perfectly, and his movements conveyed the confidence of a predator on the hunt. Jason tensed, clutching his glass. He didn't know the man, but something about his manner, the way he leaned toward Elizabeth, whispering something in her ear, provoked an instinctive revulsion in him. Elizabeth laughed, her hand resting on the man's forearm, lingering a second longer than necessary. She threw her head back, her eyes sparkling, and Jason felt a prick in his chest, sharp as a needle. He knew that look of hers, flirtatious, playful, but usually it was directed at him, Jason, in those moments when they were teasing each other at dinner or dancing on their anniversaries. Now that look belonged to someone else. Glenn Harper, a voice muttered nearby, and Jason turned around. His old friend, Paul Winters, an economics reporter, stood nearby with a glass of champagne in his hand. Paul nodded towards the man. Brokers play the stock market like the devil plays a violin. They say he ruined a couple of companies, but always gets away with it. And, Paul lowered his voice, he loves other people's wives. Jason clenched his teeth, forcing himself to smile. Sounds like a typical Chicago scumbag. Paul chuckled. Maybe so. But be careful, Jay. He's not just a creep. It's slippery, knows how to get into your head. Jason nodded, but his gaze had already returned to Elizabeth. Glenn Harper was still there, his hand now lightly touching her shoulder, and she didn't move away. On the contrary, she leaned closer, her lips moving, responding to his whisper. Jason felt the blood pounding in his temples. He took a step forward, but stopped. What was he going to do? Make a scene? It wasn't his style. He was Jason Crow, a man who solved problems with words, not fists. But now words seemed useless. He remembered the first time he and Elizabeth met in Boston, in a small bar where she worked as a waitress while she was in college. She spilled beer on him, laughed, and said, "Now you have to marry me so I don't feel guilty." He fell in love with her laugh, her sass, the way she looked at him as if he were the only person in the room. Now she was looking at Glenn Harper like that, and it cut deeper than he could have expected. Jason forced himself to look away and headed to the bar for more bourbon. The bartender, a young guy with a tattoo on his wrist, noticed his tense face. "Rough evening, sir?" "Not yet," Jason muttered, accepting the glass. "But I feel what will happen." He returned to the crowd, trying to distract himself. I said hello to a couple of colleagues, listened to the senator's boring story about the new bill, even joked with the photographer Harold, who photographed guests for gossip columns. But his eyes kept returning to Elizabeth. She was now standing by the fireplace, still with Glenn, her hand clutching a glass of champagne, and he leaned towards her, his lips almost touching her ear. Jason saw her nod, her smile widening, and something inside him cracked. He remembered their 20th wedding anniversary, when they eloped to New Orleans, leaving the children with their grandmother. They danced in the street-to-street jazz, drunk on margaritas and each other. Then she told him, "You are my home, Jay. Wherever I go, I always come back to you." These words have been his anchor all these years. Now they sounded like mockery. Jason took another sip, feeling the alcohol burn his throat. He tried to convince himself that it didn't mean anything. Elizabeth loved to flirt. It was part of her charm. She always came back to him, always. But when he looked at her again, Glenn put his hand on her waist, and she didn't move away. Instead, she turned to him, her face so close to his that Jason felt the air leave his lungs. He set the glass down on the nearby table, his fingers clenching into fists. He knew he had to do something, come over, interrupt, remind her who he was. But my legs seemed rooted to the floor. He stood watching his wife, Liz, disappear into this man, and her every laugh, her every gesture was like a knife cutting deeper. The crowd around moved as if in slow motion. Did the jazz get louder, or was it just the blood pounding in his ears? Jason noticed several of the guests giving him glances, curious, sympathetic, amused. He was Jason Crow, a man whose articles had destroyed careers, but now he felt helpless, like a boy who had been betrayed for the first time. Glenn Harper turned, and their eyes met. His smile was slow, almost defiant, as if he knew Jason could see everything and could do nothing. Elizabeth did not notice this exchange of glances. She was too absorbed in the conversation. Her hand still lay on his elbow. Jason felt rage mixed with pain, creating a storm in his chest that he could barely contain. Hotel Hall Drake pulsated with life, like the heart of a huge beast. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft light on the faces of the guests, whose smiles were honed by years of social events. A jazz quartet played a Gershwin melody, its notes floating above the hum of conversations the clink of glasses, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Jason Crow stood to the side, his fingers gripping his glass of bourbon so tightly his knuckles turned white. His gaze was fixed on Elizabeth, his wife, his Liz, who was now laughing, touching the arm of Glenn Harper, a man with the habits of a predator and a smile that made Jason's jaw ache. He wanted to come up and interrupt this performance, but something pride, fear, or just instinct kept him in place. And then he felt a light touch on his elbow. Jason turned around, ready to dismiss yet another acquaintance with idle chatter, but saw a woman whose eyes stopped him like a blow. Her face was pale, almost ghostly under the makeup, and her dark hair, carelessly tied into a bun, spilled out onto her temples. She held a glass of whiskey, but her fingers trembled, betraying tension. Her dress, deep green and low-cut, looked expensive but worn half-heartedly, like armor rather than jewelry. Jason frowned, not recognizing her. "Don't do this," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the hall, but it cut through Jason like a blade. She looked not at him, but at Elizabeth and Glenn, and there was so much pain in her gaze that Jason felt his own anxiety increase. "Sorry?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even, although everything was boiling inside. He looked at Elizabeth again. She was now standing a little closer to Glenn. Her hand was still on his elbow, and he was whispering something to her, his lips almost touching her ear. Jason clenched his teeth, feeling the bourbon burn his throat, but bringing no relief. The woman stepped closer, her eyes finally meeting him. "Don't do this," she repeated, her voice firmer now, but still trembling with pent-up emotion. He already lured her. "His people are watching you." Jason blinked, trying to process her words. "What do you mean? Who are you anyway?" His tone was harsher than he intended, but he couldn't hide his irritation. This woman, this stranger, was invading his world, his pain, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to listen to her. She didn't back down, although her lips twitched as if she were fighting the urge to leave. Instead, she nodded towards the two men standing at opposite ends of the room. One, stocky, with short hair and a gaze that missed nothing, loomed at the door of the balcony, his arms folded on his chest, but his posture was tense, like that of a security guard. Another, thin, with long fingers drumming on a glass, stood at the exit, his eyes skimming the crowd, but every now and then returning to Jason. They were invisible to most of the guests, but now that she pointed them out, Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "His people," she repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They make sure no one interferes. He always does this." Jason turned to her, his heart beating faster. "Who are you?" he asked again, but now his voice was less angry and more wary. He felt like this woman knew something he didn't, and that scared him more than Glenn Harper's smile. She took a sip of whiskey, her fingers squeezing the glass until the glass seemed about to crack. "My name is Caitlin," she said finally, her eyes drooping as if it hurt her to say her name. "Caitlin Morris. And I." She trailed off, her gaze darting to Elizabeth, who was laughing louder now, her hand sliding up Glenn's sleeve, and Jason felt his stomach clench. "I was where you are now," Caitlin finished. Her voice was almost lifeless, but there was truth in it. Jason froze, his mind trying to grasp her words. He wanted to brush it off, to say that she was mistaken, that Elizabeth was his wife. His Liz would never. But the image of her laughter, her hand on Glenn, her gaze that no longer belonged to him, haunted him. He forced himself to look at Caitlin, and her face haggard, with dark circles under her eyes hidden by makeup, was like a mirror of his own fears. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost foreign. He didn't want to hear the answer, but he knew he had to. Caitlin took a deep breath, her shoulders tensing as if she were bracing herself for impact. "7 years ago," she began, her words were slow, each like a stone falling into a bottomless well. "I was here. At the same gala evening, with the same people. I was happy. My husband, David, was nearby, so we were going to donate a large sum to the Children's Fund. Everything was perfect." She smiled bitterly, her eyes sparkled, but she blinked away the tears. And then he appeared, Glenn Harper. The name cut through Jason like a knife. He glanced at Glenn, who was now leading Elizabeth towards the fireplace, his hand on her waist, and she didn't move away. Jason clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he forced himself to listen to Caitlin. He was charming, she continued, her voice trembling, but she did not stop. He spoke to me as if I were the only woman in the room. He joked, laughed, touched my hand, and I gave in. She fell silent, her gaze falling on the glass, and Jason saw her fingers tremble more strongly. I didn't think it meant anything. Just flirting, just a game, but he knew what he was doing. He always knows. Jason felt his throat tighten. He wanted to interrupt her, to say that Elizabeth was different, that his wife would never go beyond flirting, but the words stuck. He remembered how Elizabeth had looked at him this morning distantly, almost coldly, and this image mixed with what he saw now. Her smile, her laughter, her hand on Glenn. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice barely audible, but Caitlin caught it. She looked up, and there was such emptiness in them that Jason involuntarily took half a step back. "He took me to the balcony," she said, her words like a shot in the silence. "It was quiet there, just the two of us. He proposed to me. He said that he wanted to spend the night with me, that it would be our secret, that no one would know." She swallowed, her voice became quieter. "I was stupid. I went with him, and it ruined everything." Jason felt the floor give out from under his feet. He looked at Elizabeth, who was now standing by the fireplace, her face so close to Glenn that their breath seemed to be mingling. He wanted to scream, rush to her, pull her out of this nightmare, but Caitlin's words chained him to the spot. "My husband found out," she continued. Her voice was now almost a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer. "He couldn't look at me. He left. My children, I had 3, the youngest was 10. They heard gossip. Someone told them the truth. They stopped talking to me. My parents took them, and I." She fell silent, her eyes filled with tears, but she clenched her teeth, not letting them fall. "I spent 7 months in the clinic, psychiatric, because I couldn't live with what I did." Jason felt his heart stop. He saw Caitlin's pain, her broken life, and it was like a warning, like a cry from the future that he did not want to accept. He looked again at Elizabeth, at Glenn, at their too close distance, and his mind screamed, "This can't be true. Not with Liz. Not with us." Caitlin followed his gaze and stepped closer, her voice becoming urgent. "He wants to take her to the balcony," she said, pointing to the doors where a stocky man stood, whose eyes were now fixed on Jason. "This is his plan. He always does this. He lures them to a place where no one can see, where he can." She fell silent, her face distorted with memories. "If she goes, you won't be able to do anything." He's already in her head. Jason felt rage and fear mix in his chest, creating a storm that he could barely contain. He looked at Elizabeth, who was now nodding at Glenn, her smile bright, almost blinding. He saw Glenn lean closer, his hands sliding around her waist, and Jason felt his world begin to crumble. He wanted to rush to her, to pull her out of this nightmare, but Caitlin's words echoed in his head. "His people are watching you. If she goes, there's nothing you can do." He turned to Caitlin, his voice hoarse, almost foreign. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, and there was more pain in his words than he wanted to show. "Why now?" Caitlin looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "Because I see the way you look at her," she said quietly. "You love her, and I know what it's like to lose everything because of him. I couldn't save myself, but maybe I can help you." Jason clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, leaving red crescents. He looked at Elizabeth, at Glenn, at the balcony doors, which now seemed like a portal to hell. He felt time slow down, every beat of his heart echoing in his ears. He knew he had to do something, but what? Make a scene? Grab her hand and lead her away? Or stand and watch his life fall apart? Caitlin touched his hand. Her fingers were cold as ice. "Be smart," she whispered. "Don't let him win." But Jason wasn't sure if he could. He looked at Elizabeth, at her laughter, at her hand still resting on Glenn, and felt his heart break. It was a gala evening, an evening of charity and smiles, But for Jason Crow it became a battleground where he was already beginning to lose. Jason Crow stood in the shadow of a column, his fingers clutching an empty glass of bourbon, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth. His wife, Liz, the woman with whom he had shared 27 years of his life, was now smiling at Glenn Harper, her eyes sparkling as if he were the only person in that crowded room. Jason felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat reverberating through his temples, but he couldn't look away. Glenn leaned toward her, his hand on her waist, and Elizabeth didn't move away. She nodded, her lips curling into the smile that Jason had once considered his own. He remembered how she had smiled at him at their wedding, standing in a simple white dress in a small church in Boston, her eyes shining with the promise of eternity. Now that smile belonged to someone else, and her every gesture was like a blow to the solar plexus. Caitlin Morris, the woman who had opened his eyes to Glenn a moment ago, was still standing nearby. Her words, "He's already lured her in. His people are watching you," echoed in his head like a sentence. Jason glanced at the two men she indicated. One, stocky, stone-faced, loomed at the balcony door, his eyes skimming the crowd, but every now and then returning to Jason. Another, thin, with nervous fingers, stood at the exit, his gaze as tenacious as a hawk. They were part of Glenn's game, his retinue, and Jason realized that he was trapped invisible, but as real as the walls of this room. He watched as Elizabeth, still smiling, took a step towards the balcony doors, led by Glenn. Her black dress, tight-fitting like a second skin, swayed as she moved. The diamond necklace, his 25th birthday gift, sparkled, reflecting the light of the chandeliers. Jason felt his throat constrict, the air becoming thick, almost tangible. He wanted to scream, rush to her, pull her out of this nightmare, but his legs seemed chained to the floor. He saw Glenn open the glass door to let Elizabeth in, his hand slid across her back, and she didn't flinch away. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the sound was like a gunshot to Jason's heart. His world narrowed to this scene, the glass doors behind which his wife had disappeared, and the dark silhouette of Glenn standing too close to her. Jason felt his fingers crunch around the glass and forced himself to unclench his hand, afraid the glass would crack. He could not see what was happening on the balcony, the doors were frosted, and the light inside the hall made it difficult to see the details, but his imagination painted pictures that made his blood run cold. He imagined how Glenn leaned even closer, how his lips touched her ear, how she laughed, forgetting about him, about their life, about their children. Caitlin put her hand on his shoulder, her touch light but firm, like an anchor in a storm. "I know how much it hurts," she said quietly, her voice trembling, but there was a strange strength in it, as if she had already gone through this hell and survived. "But now you have to be smarter." Jason turned to her, his eyes burning, a mixture of rage and despair spilling out. "Smarter?" he said hoarsely, his voice almost a growl. "My wife just left with this bastard on the balcony, and you're telling me to be smarter? What should I do, Caitlin? Stand and watch him." He fell silent, unable to finish. His chest was heaving, his breathing was heavy, as if he had run a marathon. Caitlin didn't look away, her face pale but determined, as if she saw his pain and understood it better than he did. "I know," she said, her voice was soft, but there was a ring of steel in it. "I know how I want to rush in there, grab her, make a scene. But this is what he is waiting for. He wants you to lose control, to make you a laughing stock. His people," she nodded at the stocky man at the balcony, who was now looking directly at Jason. "They are ready to intervene if you make a move. It's his game, Jason, and he is a master at it." Jason clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached. He felt the rage boiling inside him, like lava ready to burst out. He remembered his and Elizabeth's first anniversary, dancing in their tiny Boston apartment to an old Frank Sinatra record, laughing until they choked. Then she said, "You're my first choice, Jay, always." Now those words sounded like a lie, like a mockery, and he hated himself for still clinging to them. He looked at the balcony doors, behind which Elizabeth and Glenn had disappeared. The light from the hall was reflected in the glass, creating the illusion of movement, but he could not see anything. His mind screamed, "Go there. Stop it." She's your wife. But Caitlin's words held him like chains. He knew that she was right. The scene would not bring Elizabeth back, would not fix what was already cracked in their marriage. But standing and doing nothing was unbearable, as if he were betraying himself. Why is she doing this? He burst out. His voice was quiet, almost broken. He didn't look at Caitlin. His gaze was fixed on the doors, but the question was for her. Why Liz? Why did she go with him? Caitlin was silent for a few seconds, her hand still on his shoulder, and Jason could feel the warmth of her fingers through the fabric of his tuxedo. When she spoke, her voice was full of pain, but also of sympathy. Because he makes her feel different, she said. He says what she wants to hear, what she may have stopped hearing at home. He makes her the center of the world, even if it's a lie. And she doesn't see that it's a trap. Jason closed his eyes. Her words were like salt in the wound. He remembered the last months. Elizabeth, always busy, always on the phone, her distant glances, her short answers. He thought it was just stress, her new position in Sterling Press, pressure from Marion Clark. But now he saw that it was more a void that he had not noticed until it was filled by someone else. He opened his eyes and looked at Caitlin. Her face was tense, but there was no condemnation in her gaze, only understanding. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "When did this happen to you?" Caitlin swallowed, her fingers gripping the glass of whiskey, and Jason noticed how her nails turned white. "I followed him," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I thought it didn't mean anything, just an adventure. But then I returned home, and my husband. He looked at me as if I was a stranger. He left after a week. My children." She fell silent, her eyes sparkled, but she pressed her lips together, not allowing the tears to fall. "I lost everything, and I don't want you to repeat my mistake." Jason felt his rage give way to something heavier, despair. He looked again at the balcony doors, but they remained closed, like a gate to another world where he had no access. He imagined Elizabeth there with Glenn, her laugh, her look, her hands touching him, and it was like poison slowly spreading through his veins. He didn't make a scene, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. His pride, his fear, his love for Elizabeth, everything mixed into one knot that suffocated him. He stood looking at the closed doors, feeling his world crumbling, and did not take a single step. Caitlin was silent, her hand still on his shoulder, and it was the only thing that kept him from breaking his glass against the wall. The evening dragged on endlessly. The guests continued to laugh, dance, drink, not noticing how Jason Crow's life was falling apart. He waited, hoping that Elizabeth would return, that she would come out of those doors with a smile and say that it was a joke, that she was just talking, that everything was fine. But the doors remained closed, and with every minute his hope faded. As the gala began to end, Jason realized that Elizabeth would not be returning. He stood at the exit. His tuxedo was slightly wrinkled, and his eyes burned with suppressed emotions. Caitlin was long gone, leaving him alone with his pain. He pulled out his phone, hoping for a message, any sign, but the screen was blank. He called a limousine, got into the car, and drove home, feeling the emptiness filling his chest. At home, he poured himself more bourbon, but did not drink. He sat in the living room in the dark, looking at a photograph of him and Elizabeth in Italy, laughing under the Tuscan sun. His phone vibrated, and he grabbed it like a drowning man would grab a life preserver. On the screen was a message from Elizabeth, as short as a blow. "I need time. Don't wait for me." Jason stared at the words, his fingers trembling. He wanted to answer, wanted to dial her number, scream, beg, demand an explanation, but instead he just watched the screen go blank. His heart sank as if someone had torn a piece out of him, and he realized that this was just the beginning. Elizabeth had made her choice, and now he had to decide who he would become in this new, shattered world. Jason Crow woke up feeling like someone had turned off the lights in his world. He lay in their huge bed, in the bedroom that had once been their sanctuary, but now seemed too big, too empty. The sheets on Elizabeth's side were cold, untouched, as if she had never slept there. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, drawing pale stripes on the oak floor, but even it looked dim, devoid of warmth. Jason turned, hoping to see her next to her, her blonde hair spread out on the pillow, her slight smile in her sleep, but reality hit him like a slap in the face. She didn't return. Not at night, not in the morning. Only emptiness. He lay motionless, his body heavy, as if gravity had doubled overnight. His chest was tight, his breathing was shallow, and he did not immediately realize that this was not just fatigue, it was pain, deep, like a crack in the foundation of their house. Jason closed his eyes, trying to push away the memories of the gala, but they came into his head like uninvited guests. Elizabeth laughing with Glenn Harper, her hand on his elbow, her look that was no longer his. The balcony doors closed behind them. Message on his phone, "I need time. Don't wait for me." Each word was like a knife cutting deeper. He forced himself to sit up, his muscles protesting as if unwilling to obey. The bed, with its expensive mattress and Egyptian cotton, felt foreign, as if he had woken up in a hotel rather than his own home. Jason ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble, and realized that he hadn't shaved yesterday, a small thing, but it added to his feeling that everything was spinning out of control. He looked at the bedside table, where his phone lay, black, silent, like a tombstone. His fingers froze above him, but he still grabbed the device, hoping, fearing, hating himself for this weakness. The screen lit up and Jason felt his heart skip a beat. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, not even the stupid emoji that Elizabeth sometimes sent when she was late. Just emptiness, cold as the winter wind over Lake Michigan. He opened their correspondence and scrolled to her last message, sent at 1:47 am. "I need time. Don't wait for me." He reread it over and over again, as if he could find something new in these 6 words, some hint that this was a mistake, that she would return, that their life did not collapse in one evening. But there were 6 words, and they were just as ruthless as the first time. Jason threw the phone onto the bed, his fingers trembling. He stood up, bare feet touching the cold floor, and headed towards the kitchen, where the coffee machine Elizabeth had bought in Milan still stood. It cost them $2,000, and he laughed at the time, calling it a coffee Mercedes. Now this car was the only thing that reminded her of her presence. He turned it on, mechanically pouring the beans, but the coffee, which he poured into his old ceramic mug with the logo Chicago Herald, cooled down while he looked out the window. The hopes he had yesterday disappeared like steam from a mug, leaving only a bitter aftertaste. The kitchen was too quiet. Usually in the morning there was Elizabeth's voice, her steps, her phone vibrating with messages. Now the silence was deafening, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for her return. Jason sat down at the island, his gaze falling on the photograph on the wall. He and Elizabeth in Tuscany, their faces illuminated by the sun, her arm around his waist. He remembered that day they drank Chianti, laughed at how Nathan tried to learn Italian, and called the waiter Mr. Spaghetti. Then their life seemed indestructible. Now this photograph was like a mockery, like a lie that he had believed for too long. He picked up the phone again, his thumb hovering over the name Liz. He wanted to call, scream, and demand that she explain where she was, with whom, and why. But something inside pride, or perhaps fear of hearing the truth, stopped him. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts and settled on Mark Reynolds. Mark was his best friend, his brother in arms, with whom he went through thick and thin in the army, even before Jason became a journalist, and Mark was a lawyer whose name scared the corporate sharks of Chicago. If anyone could help him get out of this nightmare, it was Mark. Jason pressed the call, and after the second ring, he heard a familiar voice, hoarse from morning laziness. "Jay? Damn, did you know it's 7 in the morning? What's happened?" Jason swallowed, his throat as dry as the desert. "Mark, this is the end," he said, his voice quiet but firm, as if he had already made a decision that he was not yet fully aware of. "I want a divorce." There was silence on the other end of the line, so long that Jason could hear the clock ticking on the kitchen wall. Finally, Mark coughed, his voice becoming stern, like a commander before a battle. "Are you sure, Jay? This is the nuclear option." "What the hell happened?" Jason clutched his mug, his fingers turning white. He closed his eyes and images of the gala flowed into his mind like a poisonous river. Yesterday there was a gala evening, he began. His voice was even, but anger was bubbling beneath it. For the Children's Fund in Drake, Liz and I went together. Everything was as usual. She was. She was dazzling, Mark. A black dress, my necklace around my neck, a smile that made the audience fall silent. I was proud of her, as always. But then this bastard showed up. He fell silent, his breathing became heavy. Mark didn't interrupt, and Jason was grateful for that. He continued, his words slow, as if each one came out with effort. His name is Glenn Harper. Some broker, slippery like a snake. He approached her and began to talk, whispering something in her ear. She laughed, touched his hand, his shoulder. I looked, Mark, and felt as if someone was taking out my heart. I wanted to intervene, but... He swallowed, his voice wavering. Some woman, Caitlin, stopped me. She said that he had already lured her, that his people were watching me. She told how he destroyed her marriage 7 years ago, how he seduced her at the same evening, how she lost her husband, children, everything. Jason fell silent, his fingers trembling, and he set the mug on the table, afraid that he would break it. He saw Elizabeth before his eyes, her smile, her steps towards the balcony, and it was like a horror movie that he could not turn off. I stood there like an idiot, he continued, his voice becoming quieter, but there was pain in it. I watched her follow him, Mark. She went with him to the balcony, smiling as if I didn't exist. The doors closed and I didn't do anything. I just stood there because this Caitlin said that the scene would only make it worse, that he was waiting for this. But damn, I felt like I was dying. Mark made a low sound, somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Jay, this is bullshit. But you don't know what was there. Maybe she's just... She didn't come back, Jason snapped, his voice sharp as a blade. All evening, Mark. I waited until the guests began to leave, until the orchestra fell silent. I drove home alone, sat in the living room like a fool, hoping she would show up. And then, at 2 in the morning, she sent a message. He paused, his throat tightening, but he forced himself to continue. I need time. Don't wait for me. That's it. 6 words, and everything we had went to hell. The silence on the other end was as heavy as lead. Jason could hear Mark breathing and the chair creaking as if he had stood up. Finally, Mark spoke. His voice was stern, but there was anxiety in it. Jay, listen, I know how much it hurts, but divorce is no joke. Are you sure you want to go down this path? Maybe she'll come back and explain. She made a choice. Jason cut him off, his voice as cold as steel. She chose him, Mark. She left with him, knowing that I was there, knowing that I could see. She didn't call, didn't write anything except that damn message. I don't know where she is, whether she's with him or not, but I know one thing. I won't be the one who waits for her to decide whether she needs me or not. Now it's my turn. Mark exhaled, and Jason imagined running his hand through his hair, like he always did when things got out of hand. Okay, Mark said finally, if you are determined, I am with you. But Jay, this will be a war. Elizabeth is not just your wife, she is a shark in the business world. She won't give up without a fight. Let him try, Jason replied. His voice was firm, but inside he felt like something was crumbling. He looked at the cold coffee, at the empty kitchen, at the photograph of their happy past, and realized that the war had already begun. Not with Elizabeth, not with Glenn, but with herself, with the part that still loved her, despite the pain. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye and stared out the window, where the gray Chicago morning was slowly settling over the city. The coffee in the mug was cold, like his hopes, but a new fire lit up in his chest, not love, not forgiveness, but something dark, decisive, ready to burn everything that was left of their ideal life. He stood up from the kitchen island, where the cold coffee was still sitting in a mug, and looked at his watch. 6:45 am. The house was silent as a tomb, only the ticking of the wall clock broke the silence. Jason pulled out his phone and opened his contact list. His fingers hovered over the name Tommy Lockwood, a mechanic he had known since his first job at Chicago Herald, when reporting on minor urban issues. Tommy was as reliable as a Swiss watch, and more importantly, he didn't ask questions. Tommy, this is Jason Crow, he said when he answered on the third ring, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I need to change all the locks in the house. Today, now." There was a rustling sound on the other end, as if Tommy was sitting up in bed. "Jay, damn it, it's not 7 in the morning yet. What's the rush? Are the locks broken?" "No," Jason snapped, his tone sharp as a blade. "Just do it. I'll pay double the rate if you're here in an hour." Tommy paused, then chuckled. "Okay, boss. Give me the address. I'm on my way." Jason dictated the address of their Victorian mansion in Oak Park, feeling the first step in his plan gave him a strange sense of control. He didn't know whether Elizabeth would return today, tomorrow, or ever, but he knew one thing for sure. If she came, she would not enter this house as if nothing had happened. This was his home, his castle, and he would not allow her to cross the threshold until she answered for her actions. By 7 in the morning, Tommy was standing at the front door, his tattered jacket and toolbox looking out of place against the manicured porch. He was short, with gray hair at the temples and a look that had seen too many other people's dramas to be surprised. "What locks are we changing?" he asked, chewing a toothpick. "Entrance, rear, garage." "That's it," Jason answered, his voice as cold as the morning air. "Every lock has a key. I want them to become useless." Tommy raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. He simply nodded and got to work, his drill buzzing like a battle cry. Jason stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the old castles fall one by one. Every click, every sound of metal was like a hammer blow on his past. He remembered the first time Elizabeth had entered this house, how she had laughed, running through the empty rooms, planning where their bedroom would be, where Nathan and Olivia's nursery would be. Then they were a team, a family. Now she had chosen Glenn Harper, and that choice demanded an answer. By 8 in the morning, Tommy was done. He handed Jason a set of new keys, shiny as his determination. "Everything is ready," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "She won't come in without calling. Do you want me to put something else? Chains, maybe?" Jason shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "That's enough. Thank you, Tommy." He paid in cash, adding the promised surcharge, and escorted the locksmith to the door. As Tommy's truck pulled away, Jason closed the door and leaned his forehead against it, feeling the coolness of the new lock under his fingers. This was the first step, small but significant. He didn't just lock Elizabeth outside, he started cutting her off from his life. The next stop was her car. Elizabeth adored her BMW X5, black like her gala dress, with ivory leather interior. Jason gave it to her for their 25th wedding anniversary, along with the diamond necklace she wore while flirting with Glenn yesterday. The car cost $65,000, but for Elizabeth, it was not just transport, it was a symbol of her status, her independence, her triumph in sterling press. Now Jason saw her only as a reminder of her betrayal. He found an advertisement on the internet for the sale of used cars and contacted the first dealer who responded. A guy named Rico, with a South Chicago accent, agreed to come over in an hour. Jason didn't bargain or explain. He simply said, "BMW X5 2022 ideal. $3,000, take it today." Rico whistled. "3 pieces? Are you serious, man? This car costs as much as my mortgage." "Seriously," Jason snapped, his voice as cold as ice. "Come before I change my mind." By 10 o'clock in the morning, Rico parked his beat-up pickup truck at the house. He was young, about 30, with a dragon tattoo on his neck and a look that said he was used to strange deals. Jason led him into the garage, where the BMW stood, shining as if it had just come off the assembly line. Rico walked around the car, ran his finger over the hood, and looked into the interior. "Dude, it smells like a salon here. Gucci. Are you sure you want to sell it for 3 mowers? It's..." He paused when he saw Jason's face. "Take it or leave it," Jason said, his eyes hard as granite. He took out the keys and documents that Elizabeth kept in a drawer in the office. "Sign, pay, and it's yours." Rico shrugged, clearly deciding that it wasn't worth arguing with a man who looked like he was ready to punch through a wall. He counted out $300 bills, crumpled as if they had been pulled from under a mattress, and handed them to Jason. He took the money without counting it and signed the contract, feeling how each line cut off another piece of their past. As Rico drove off in the BMW, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust, Jason looked at the wad of bills in his hand. $3,000 is a mockery of their marriage, of his gift, of her choice. He returned to the house, found an old tax envelope in the office, and stuffed the money inside. On the envelope, he wrote in black marker, "For your freedom, Liz." It was a gesture of cold, poisonous irony, and Jason felt a grim satisfaction in imagining her face when she saw him. He placed the envelope on the kitchen island, next to her favorite vase where she kept her keys. It was not just a message, it was a declaration of war. But changing the locks and selling the car was just the beginning. Jason knew that the real fight would not be with Elizabeth, but with Glenn Harper, the man who dared to invade his life, take his wife, and destroy his world. He couldn't just sit and wait for the pain to consume him. He needed to act, know who he was dealing with, and, if necessary, destroy the bastard. He picked up his phone again and found the number of Vince Collins, the private investigator he had worked with when he was investigating corruption in City Hall for Harold. Vince was an ex-cop, as cynical as a Chicago winter, but his instincts were unerring. He could find dirt where others saw only glitter. "Vince, this is Jason Crow," he said when he answered. His voice was even, but there was a ring of steel in it. "I need your help." Vince chuckled, his voice hoarse from cigarettes. "Crow, you always call when it smells hot." "What's this time? Is the mayor in shit again?" "Not the mayor," Jason replied, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Personal. I need a file on one person. Glenn Harper, broker, lives in Chicago, plays the stock market, loves." He fell silent, his throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "He likes to destroy families." Vince paused, and Jason imagined him squinting, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Got it," he said finally. "What do you want? Basic or full layout?" "Find everything," Jason said, his voice low, almost a growl. "I want to know how he breathes, Vince. Where he lives, who he sleeps with, what he eats for breakfast. His deals, his debts, his enemies. If he sneezed in 2005, I want to know where and why." Vince whistled. "It won't be cheap, Curo. And dangerous. People like him are usually covered up." "I don't care," Jason snapped. "Name the price, I will pay. Just do it." "Okay," Vince said, and there was a hint of respect in his voice. "Give me a couple of days, I'll start digging. But Jay, be careful. If he is who you think he is not just a broker. These guys have long arms." "Me too," Jason replied, his lips curling into a cold smile. He hung up and looked at the envelope with money lying on the table. It was only the first step, but he felt control returning to him, rage turning into a plan. Glenn Harper and Elizabeth made their moves. Now it was Jason's turn, and he wasn't about to lose. Sunday in Chicago was cold, with low clouds that seemed to weigh down on the city like a coffin lid. Jason Crow spent the day alone in their Victorian mansion, which now seemed more like a museum of their past than a home. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't check the news, didn't answer the phone. He just sat in his office, sorting through papers that meant nothing and drinking bourbon, which didn't bring relief. An envelope containing $3,000, the proceeds from Elizabeth's BMW, lay on the kitchen island like a mine ready to explode. His inscription, "For your freedom, Liz," was written in his hand, but now seemed alien, as if it had been left by someone else, someone ready to burn everything they had built. In the evening, as dusk began to deepen, Jason heard the sound of a car driving up to the house. His heart began to pound, but he forced himself to remain where he was, looking out the office window. The taxi's headlights illuminated the driveway, and he saw her, Elizabeth, getting out of the car with a small purse in her hand. She didn't look the same as usual. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her coat was wrinkled, and her face was pale, as if she had not slept. But even in this state, she was beautiful, and it cut Jason more than he expected. He hated himself for still noticing it. Elizabeth walked to the front door, her steps fast, almost nervous. Jason heard her insert the key into the lock, and the sound of the metal scraping against the new lock was like music, dark but satisfying. The key didn't work. She tried again, her movements became sharper, and then there was a knocking sound, light at first, then louder, more insistent. Jason. Her voice broke through the door, sharp, with a hint of panic. Jason, open up. This is my home. Jason sat motionless, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. Her words, my home, were like sparks igniting his anger. He remembered her smile at the gala, her hand on Glenn Harper, the closed balcony doors, her message, I need time. Don't wait for me. This was not her home. No more. The knocking became louder, almost desperate. Jason, I know you're there. Open it, damn it. Her voice trembled, but it still had that authority that she used in sterling presto to force people to obey. Jason felt his lips curl into a cold smile. Did she think she could come back as if nothing had happened and he would just open the door? No, Liz. Not today. He stood up, his movements slow, almost ritualistic. He took the envelope from the kitchen island, feeling the crumpled bills rustle under his fingers, and headed for the door. The knocking continued, now mixed with her screams. Jason, this is not funny. Open it now. He turned the new lock, feeling the mechanism click, and swung the door open. Elizabeth stood on the threshold, her eyes wide open, her face flushed with anger and cold. She was still wearing the same coat she had worn to the gala, but now it looked as rumpled as her dignity. Behind her, the taxi was still waiting, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jason, what the hell? She blurted out, her voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. Why don't my keys work? This is my home. Jason looked at her, his eyes as cold as Lake Michigan in winter. He held the envelope in his hand, his fingers gripping it like a weapon. Your house, he said, his voice low and venomous. He took a step forward, causing her to retreat onto the porch. You left with him, Liz. You chose him. This is not your home anymore. Elizabeth blinked, her lips parted, but she couldn't find the words. Jason could see her confidence cracking, how she was trying to pull herself together, but he didn't give her a chance. He held out the envelope, his movements abrupt, almost theatrical. This is for your BMW, he said, his voice icy. $3,000. Good deal, right? Her eyes widened, and she grabbed the envelope, her fingers trembling. Did you sell my car? She gasped, her voice hoarse, as if the air had left her lungs. Jason, how dare you? This was yours? He snapped, his grin growing wider, but there was no warmth in it. You gave him more than a car, Liz. Don't play the victim. He noticed her hands, her fingers, and his gaze fell on the wedding ring, a thin platinum band with a diamond that he had chosen with such care 27 years ago. Take it off, he said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. It's not yours anymore. Elizabeth froze, her eyes filled with tears, but she pressed her lips together, trying to save her face. Jason, please, she whispered. Let's talk. I can explain. Take it off, he repeated. His voice did not waver. She slowly took off the ring, her fingers trembling, and handed it to him. Jason took it, feeling the coldness of the metal, and stuffed it into his pocket like it was trash. His gaze slid to her other hand, where there would be a sapphire ring, her favorite, given for their 20th anniversary when they eloped to New Orleans. But there was no ring. Jason felt his heart clench, his rage flaring up with renewed vigor. Where is it? He asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushed. She was silent, her lips trembling, and Jason knew the answer before she spoke. I gave it to him, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but every word was like a blow. Jason felt the world around him slow down. He looked at her, at the woman he loved, whom he trusted, for whom he built this life, and saw only betrayal. Glenn Harper. The name was like poison coursing through his veins. She gave the ring, their ring, to that bastard, as if their marriage meant nothing. He didn't say a word. He simply slammed the door. The sound was loud, like a gunshot, cutting her off from him, from their home, from their past. Elizabeth shouted something, her voice muffled, but Jason didn't listen. He leaned against the door, his breathing heavy, his fists clenched. She kept the envelope, he kept the ring, but the pain he felt was theirs, and it was just beginning. Monday at Sterling Press began with the usual bustle. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the open space office on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in the center of Chicago. But beneath this routine, a storm was already brewing, ready to tear Elizabeth Crow's reputation to shreds. Rumors about her act at the gala spread faster than wildfire, fueled by whispers from colleagues, chat messages, and curious glances from those who saw her leave with Glenn Harper, leaving her husband alone in the room. Elizabeth walked into the office at 8:30 a.m., her heels clicking on the marble floor, but today her usual confidence seemed as fragile as glass. She wore a dark blue suit from Chanel, her hair was styled impeccably, but the shadows under her eyes, hidden by makeup, betrayed a sleepless night. She hadn't slept since Jason had slammed the door on her, leaving her with an envelope full of crumpled bills and an emptiness she couldn't fill. The taxi took her to the Hotel Hilton, where she spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had collapsed in 2 days. Her assistant, Linda Perez, was already waiting outside the office, holding a folder of documents. Linda was young, about 25, with kind eyes and a habit of nervously fiddling with her bracelet when something went wrong. Today her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and Elizabeth felt a pang of anxiety. "Good morning, Linda," she said, trying to sound normal, but her voice was taut as a string. "What do we have for today?" Linda didn't answer right away. She looked at Elizabeth, her lips trembled, and instead of the usual list of appointments, she blurted out, "How could you, Elizabeth?" Her voice was quiet, but full of pain, as if she was speaking not only for herself, but for everyone who knew. "How could you do this to Jason?" Elizabeth froze, her purse almost falling out of her hands. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck. Linda looked at her, her eyes shining with tears, and Elizabeth realized that the rumors were already here, in her office, in her fortress. "Linda," she began, her voice hoarse, "it's not what you think. I, isn't that right?" Linda interrupted, her voice becoming louder, attracting the glances of her colleagues from the neighboring booths. "Everyone says you went out with some broker at a gala and left Jason alone. I saw you together, Elizabeth, at parties, at events. He looked at you as if you were his world. And you." She fell silent, her voice broke, and she turned away, wiping her tears. Elizabeth felt her cheeks heat up. She wanted to protest, to explain that it was a mistake, that she didn't think it would go that far, but the truth was too hard to voice. She walked past Linda into her office, closing the door, but the silence did not bring relief. The glass walls of her office, usually a symbol of her power, now seemed like a cage where every glance from her colleagues was like an injection. She threw her purse on the table and collapsed into a chair, her fingers trembling as she turned on the computer. Her inbox was filled with letters, but one stood out from Marion Clark, CEO Sterling Press. Subject, urgently. Elizabeth opened it, her heart pounding, but before she could read, the office door swung open. Marion Clark rushed in, her eyes blazing like a hawk scenting prey. She was a woman in her 60s, with short gray hair and a reputation that made her competitors tremble. Her suit, strict and gray, was like armor, and now she looked like she was ready to destroy everything around her. "Do you understand what you've done?" Marion barked, her voice loud as thunder. She slammed the door shut, cutting them off from prying ears, but Elizabeth knew the walls were too thin to hide this conversation. "This is a disgrace to the company, Elizabeth. Shame on me." Elizabeth jumped up, her hands bracing herself on the table as if she could keep her balance. "Marion, please," she began, her voice pleading but firm. "This is personal. This has nothing to do with work." "I—" "Personal?" Marion interrupted, her eyebrows flying up. "You left with Glenn Harper in front of half of Chicago, Elizabeth. Do you think this will stay private? We have a contract with his company to publish their reports, and now I hear that you slept with him." She took a step closer, her eyes narrowed. "Do you even understand what it looks like? Our reputation, my reputation, hangs by a thread." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream that she didn't sleep with him, that it was a mistake, that she was just lost for a moment. But the truth was more complex, and she knew that Marion would not accept half-truths. "I don't." She began, but Marion waved her hand, cutting her off. "Enough," she said, her voice becoming quieter, but this made it even more terrible. "You were my best player, Elizabeth. I trusted you. But this goes beyond all limits. I'll have to discuss this with the council. Prepare for the consequences." Marion walked out, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any scream. Elizabeth sank into a chair. Her hands were shaking. She tried to breathe, but the air was thick like smoke. She grabbed the phone to call Jason, begging him to listen, but the screen was dead. She pressed the button, but nothing. Her number was blocked. Jason, or someone in his direction, disconnected her line. She was cut off, alone as ever. She sat staring at the blank screen when the door opened again. A young woman, about 20 years old, in a formal suit, came in with an envelope in her hand. Her face was neutral, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Congratulations, Mrs. Crow," she said, her voice professionally cool. "You have been given a summons." Elizabeth took the envelope, her fingers going numb. She didn't open it, there was no need. She knew what was inside. The beginning of the divorce that Jason promised her yesterday when he slammed the door. She looked at the woman who was already leaving and felt her world collapsing like a house of cards, leaving only ashes and shame. Jason Crow couldn't put it off any longer. 2 days after the gala, 2 days after Elizabeth left with Glenn Harper, leaving him empty and furious, he knew the truth had to come out not just for him, but for their children. Nathan and Olivia deserved to know what their mother did, how she destroyed their family with one choice. He didn't want this meeting, didn't want to see the pain in their eyes, but remaining silent would be a lie, and Jason was too tired of lies. On Wednesday morning, he sent Nathan and Olivia messages, short but firm. "We need to talk. Come home on Friday. It's important." He did not call. His voice could betray the emotions that he had kept locked away for now. Nathan replied an hour later, "I'll be with Emma." What happened? Olivia just wrote, "Okay, I'll come." Their brevity cut, but Jason knew they sensed his tone, not a request, but an order. By Friday, the Oak Park home, their Victorian mansion, was ready for the meeting, but it looked like the stage for tragedy. Jason removed the photographs of Elizabeth from the mantelpiece, leaving only pictures of the children. Nathan in his Yale football uniform, Olivia at her Stanford graduation. He didn't want her face to look at them while he spoke the truth. The kitchen island where the envelope containing the money for her BMW had once been was now empty, but Jason could feel its ghost as well as the ghost of their marriage. Nathan arrived first around noon. Jason heard a car pull up and walked out onto the porch, where his son, tall, with dark hair and serious eyes, was helping his fiancée Emma pull out her suitcase. Nathan was a copy of Jason in his youth, the same stubborn chin, the same shoulders, accustomed to bearing responsibility. Emma, a slender girl with brown hair and a warm smile, hugged Jason, but her gaze was wary. "Dad, what's going on?" Nathan asked. His voice was quiet, but there was anxiety in it. "You look, I don't know, like you haven't slept in a week." Jason forced himself to smile, but it came out crooked. "I'll explain everything soon, son. Let's wait for Olivia." Emma squeezed Nathan's hand. Her eyes flickered to Jason, but she said nothing. They walked into the living room, where Jason offered coffee, but the conversation didn't go well. Nathan was fiddling with a sleeve of his jacket. Emma was leafing through a magazine left on the table, and Jason was looking out the window, counting the minutes until Olivia's arrival. Olivia showed up around 2 o'clock. Her taxi stopped in front of the house, and Jason saw her get out thin, with long blonde hair like her mother, but with eyes full of anxiety. She was alone, with no luggage, just a backpack slung over her shoulder. Olivia had always been their sensitive child, the one who noticed the cracks in their family before anyone else. Jason met her at the door and hugged her, but her return hug was quick, almost formal. "Dad, what is this urgency?" she asked, her voice sharp. as if she was bracing herself for bad news. "Where is Mom?" Jason swallowed, his throat tightening. "You'll find out soon, Liv. Let's go. Nathan and Emma are already here." They gathered in the living room, the room that had once been the heart of their home. The fireplace was cold, the curtains were half drawn, and the light falling on the oak floor seemed gray like the mood. Nathan and Emma sat on the couch, their hands intertwined, as if they were looking for support in each other. Olivia settled into a chair, her backpack lying at her feet, and her eyes darted around the room, looking for clues. Jason stood by the fireplace, his fingers gripping the back of the chair as if it would keep him from falling. He wanted to start, but the doorbell broke the silence. Jason frowned. He wasn't expecting guests. He opened the door and froze. Elizabeth stood on the threshold. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. She was wearing the dark coat he had given her 2 years ago, but it looked like it weighed a ton. Next to her stood a woman of about 40, with sharp cheekbones and cold eyes, in a formal suit, holding a leather folder. "Advocate." Jason felt the rage flare up in his chest, like coals splashed with gasoline. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "And who is this?" Elizabeth opened her mouth, but the woman spoke first, her tone professionally smooth. "Mr. Crow, I'm Rebecca Stewart, Mrs. Crow's lawyer. We're here to discuss." "Discuss?" Jason cut her off, his eyes narrowing. "This is a family meeting, not a court. Go away." Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice hoarse and pleading. "Jason, please. I want to talk to the children. I have the right." "Right?" His grin was cold as ice. "You lost him when you left with him, Liz." He looked at Rebecca, whose face remained expressionless. "But since you're here, come in." "Only without her." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, but Elizabeth nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Rebecca, wait in the car," she said quietly. The lawyer shrugged and walked away, leaving Elizabeth alone. Jason led her into the living room, his heart pounding, but he kept himself under control. Nathan and Olivia jumped up, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm. Emma remained seated, her gaze wary like a cat's before a jump. "Mom?" Nathan took a step forward, his voice trembling. "What's happening? Why did Dad call us?" Elizabeth tried to smile, but her lips trembled. I just want to explain everything," she began, but Jason raised his hand to stop her. "No, Liz," he said, his voice as hard as granite. "I will do it. They must know the truth." He turned to the children, his eyes meeting theirs, Nathan, full of confusion, and Olivia, already ready for pain. Emma squeezed Nathan's hand, her face tense. Jason took a deep breath, feeling every word scratch his throat, but he didn't stop. "There was a gala on Friday," he began, his voice level but furious beneath it, "for the Children's Fund in Drake. Your mother and I were there together, as always. She looked like a star. I was proud of her. But then a man appeared, Glenn Harper." He paused when he saw Olivia flinch, as if the name was familiar to her. He approached her, started talking, and whispered something. She laughed, touched him, as if I were invisible. I watched her go out onto the balcony with him and did nothing. I waited, hoping that she would return. But she didn't return. Elizabeth gasped, her hands covering her face, but Jason continued, his words like bullets. "She didn't call for 2 days. I didn't write except for one message. I need time. When she finally showed up on Sunday, I asked about her ring, the sapphire one I gave her in New Orleans. She said she gave it to him. Him, Nathan. To him, Olivia." His voice broke, but he clenched his teeth, forcing himself to finish. "Your mother chose him. She betrayed us all." The living room was plunged into silence, so heavy that it seemed like you could cut the air with a knife. Nathan looked at Elizabeth, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Mom," he managed, his voice loud, almost a scream. "Why? Why did you do this?" Elizabeth was crying, her tears flowing down her cheeks, but she did not look at him. Her shoulders trembled, but she did not apologize, did not ask for forgiveness. She just stood there, her hands clutching her purse like a life preserver. Nathan, I didn't mean to, she whispered. It was a mistake. I didn't think that. Error. Olivia jumped up. Her eyes were burning. Her voice was sharp as a blade. Do you really think that we will forgive Mom? You left with him, gave him the ring that Dad gave you. You abandoned us. Her voice broke, and she turned away, her fists clenching. Rebecca Stewart, who had apparently heard the screams and returned, opened the door and stepped inside. Mrs. Crow, she began, her voice professionally calm, maybe we should reschedule the conversation. This is getting too. Emma jumped up, her face flushed. This is our family, not your court, she barked, her eyes flashing lightning. You are nobody here, so don't interfere. Rebecca froze, her lips pursed, but she stepped back, raising her hands in surrender. Elizabeth looked at her, then at the children, her tears flowing faster, but she was silent. Jason stood there, his hands shaking, but he felt a grim satisfaction. The truth had been told, and now their family, or what was left of it, had to decide what to do next. The living room in the Crow house was still buzzing with the tension of the family meeting, although Elizabeth had already left, leaving behind only tears and silence. Nathan and Olivia sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes lost, as if the world they knew had been cracked in half. Emma, Nathan's fiancée, held his hand, but even her presence could not soften the blow of Jason's words. Their mother had left with another man, given him the ring, and betrayed their family. Jason looked at his children, feeling his heart clench. He wanted to protect them. But the truth was the only way, and now it was tearing them all apart. Nathan stood up first, his movements jerky, as if he couldn't sit still. Dad, he said, his voice hoarse, we need to talk to Mom. By ourselves. We need to hear it. Olivia raised her head, her eyes red from crying, but she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I can't just believe it. Not from her. Jason clenched his teeth, his fingers digging into the back of the chair. He wanted to forbid, to say that Elizabeth did not deserve their time, that she had already made her choice. But he saw their faces, Nathan's confusion, Olivia's despair, and he knew he couldn't deprive them of this. They were adults, but still his children, and they needed to face the truth themselves. Okay, he said, his voice low, almost lifeless. She's in Hilton, in the center. I heard her lawyer mention this. But... He paused, his eyes meeting theirs. Don't let her fool you. Nathan nodded, his jaw clenched as if he was preparing to fight. Olivia stood up, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and she looked so small, so lost, that Jason could barely stop himself from hugging her. Emma looked at him, her gaze soft but determined. We'll figure it out, Jason, she said quietly. We'll be back. They left, leaving Jason alone in the living room, where the echo of their voices still hung in the air. He sank onto the sofa, his hands trembling, and for the first time in days he felt fatigue cover him like a wave. He didn't know what Elizabeth would say to the children, but he knew one thing. The truth had already come out, and now everything depended on whether they believed her or him. Hotel Hilton in downtown Chicago was an oasis of luxury. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the smell of expensive perfume wafting in the lobby. But for Nathan, Olivia, and Emma, it was simply a place where their mother hid from the consequences of her choices. They climbed to the 12th floor. Their steps were quiet but tense, as if they were going to trial. Nathan knocked on the door of room 1208, his fist clenched, and when the door opened, he barely recognized the woman in front of him. Elizabeth looked different from what they were used to. Her hair, usually impeccably styled, was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her face was pale, without makeup, with dark circles under her eyes. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, not her corporate armor from Chanel, and this made her vulnerable, almost a stranger. Her eyes widened when she saw them, and she stepped forward, holding out her arms. Nathan, Olivia, she breathed, her voice hoarse with tears. You have arrived. Thank you. Nathan stepped back, his face stony. We're not here for hugs, Mom, he said, his voice as cold as the morning wind. We want to know what happened. All. Elizabeth swallowed, her hands dropped, and she nodded. Fine, come in. The room was spacious, overlooking the Chicago skyline, but it felt empty, as if Elizabeth hadn't unpacked her things and didn't plan to stay. There was an unfinished bottle of wine on the table. Next to it was a glass with red traces of lipstick. Nathan and Olivia sat on the sofa. Emma remained standing by the window, her arms crossed, her gaze wary. Elizabeth sank into the chair opposite her, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater as if she were looking for something to grab onto. "I don't know what your father told you," she began. Her voice was quiet, but trembled like a string before breaking. "But I want you to hear me. It's not as easy as he thinks." Nathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Dad said you went out with some Glenn Harper at the gala, that you gave him the ring he gave you, that you haven't called for 2 days. This is true?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, her face contorting as if Nathan's words were a physical blow. She nodded, slowly, almost reluctantly. "Yes," she whispered, "this is true, but that's not the whole story." Olivia gasped, her hands gripping the arms of the sofa. "Mom, how could you?" Her voice was high, almost childish, full of pain. "Did you really leave with him, right in front of Dad?" Elizabeth opened her eyes, her tears flowing down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "I didn't plan for this," she said, her voice cracking. I was lost, Olivia. Your father, he was always cold, distanced. He loves his job, his newspaper, more than me. I felt invisible in our marriage for years. And Glenn, he made me feel alive." Nathan shook his head, his jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles showed beneath his skin. "Mom, you ruined everything," he said, his voice loud, almost a scream. "Do you think this is an excuse? That Dad was cold? You left with some bastard, gave him a ring that meant everything to our family. Do you even understand what you've done?" Elizabeth shuddered, her hands trembled, but she did not back down. "I know I was wrong," she said, her voice hoarse but with a hint of stubbornness in it. "But I didn't want to lose you. I thought it would be just a moment, that I'll come back and we'll fix everything. I didn't expect Jason." "What?" Olivia interrupted, her eyes full of tears, her voice trembling. "What won't Daddy forgive? What will he tell us the truth? Mom, I don't know how to look at you now. You were my example, my everything. And now I only see a woman who left us for some guy." Emma stepped forward, her face tense, but she didn't interfere. She just stood there, watching as Elizabeth tried to hold on to what was left of her family. Elizabeth looked at Olivia, her tears flowing faster, but she couldn't find the words. "Liv," she whispered, "please. I love you. I've always loved you." Nathan stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "Love doesn't go away with another man, Mom," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "You made a choice, and now we have to live with it." Olivia stood up too, her backpack falling to the floor, but she didn't pick it up. She looked at Elizabeth, her eyes full of pain, but also determination. "I can't stay here," she said quietly. "I can't pretend that everything is fine." Elizabeth extended her hand, but Olivia retreated, her tears streaming down her cheeks. Nathan took her by the shoulder, his gaze was firm, but there was the same pain in it. Emma opened the door, her face unreadable, and they left, leaving Elizabeth alone in the room, where the silence was louder than her sobs. Jason Crow was no longer the man Chicago knew. Editor Chicago Herald, a loving father, a devoted husband, these masks burned away in the fire of Elizabeth's betrayal, leaving only a shell inside of which a cold, methodical rage burned. Glenn Harper, the man who had stolen his life was a target, and Jason wasn't going to stop until he saw him broken. He didn't want blood, it was too easy. He wanted Glenn to feel his world crumble the same way he did. It all started with a phone call. After a family reunion where Nathan and Olivia left, leaving him feeling like he was losing them, Jason called his old friend from the army, Kevin Doyle. Kevin was more than just a fellow soldier, he was a brother, the man who pulled Jason out of the fire in Iraq, a man whose loyalty knew no bounds. Kevin now worked in private security, but his connections in a world where the rules were written in blood and duty had not gone away. "Kev, Jason said, his voice level but steely. I need help. Unofficial. Kevin didn't ask what happened. He heard Jason's tone and knew it was serious. Say the name, he replied, his voice as hoarse as gravel. Glenn Harper, Jason said, the name like poison on his tongue. Broker. Chicago. I want him to pay. Kevin paused, then chuckled. Understood. Give me a day, I'll gather the guys. The guys turned out to be 3 ex-military men from their old unit. Lucas, Luck Gray, a techie with hands that could take apart anything, from a machine gun to a server. Mike Heavy Ramirez, a bruiser with a face that scared even the cops. And Danny Woods, a hacker whose past was so dark that even Kevin didn't know all the details. They met in a bar on the outskirts of town, in a place where no one asked questions and the light was too dim to see their faces. Jason told them everything. The gala, Elizabeth, Glenn, the ring, her message. He didn't ask for sympathy, and they didn't offer it. They just listened, their eyes as cold as gun sights. We'll figure it out, Kevin said when Jason finished. But Jay, are you sure? It's not just pranks. We can go far. Jason looked at him, his face stony. I want him to feel like he's losing everything. Like me. Kevin nodded, and the campaign began. The first blow was small, almost childish, but Jason knew that these things accumulate, like drops breaking through stone. Lucas and Mike tracked Glenn's Mercedes parked outside his office in the Loop, a posh skyscraper where brokers like him made millions. While Lucas distracted the guard, Mike poured a bag of sugar into the gas tank. By morning, the car stalled halfway to the country club where Glenn planned to play golf with clients. He was late, the clients left, and his reputation took the first shot. Jason learned about this from Kevin, sitting in his office in Herald, and his lips twitched into a cold smile. This was just the beginning. 2 days later, Mike returned to Glenn's car, this time with a can of red spray paint. He didn't write anything specific, just chaotic lines, like blood smeared on a black hood. Glenn discovered it this morning as he walked out of his Gold Coast penthouse, and his scream, Mike said, could be heard 2 blocks away. He called the police, but the cops just shrugged their shoulders. Vandalism, a low-priority matter. Glenn's reputation as a man who ruined companies and slept with other people's wives worked against him. Nobody was in a hurry to help. The next blow was more painful. Lucas punctured all 4 tires on the Mercedes while Glenn was at dinner with a new client. He left the restaurant laughing, with a glass of wine in his hand, but his face turned white when he saw the car settle on the asphalt. The client left, the deal fell through, and Glenn spent an hour waiting for a tow truck in the rain, which began as if ordered. Kevin sent Jason a photo of Glenn, wet, with his cell phone to his ear, screaming at someone. Jason looked at the photo, his fingers clenching the phone, but there was no joy inside, only emptiness, as if he was looking at someone else's life. But Danny was preparing the real blow. Glenn recently bought a Ferrari 488 Spider, a $500,000 toy as red as his smugness, which he showed off on social media. Danny, sitting in his apartment littered with laptops and empty cans of energy drinks, hacked into the car's onboard system. It wasn't just hacking, it was art. He took control of the electronics, disabling the sensors and disguising the interference as a failure. Glenn drove onto I-90 Friday evening, heading to a vacation home in Lake Forest, where he was rumored to be planning to meet another woman. At 80 miles per hour, the system suddenly cut off the brakes. Glenn managed to turn the steering wheel, but the Ferrari crashed into the bump stop, its hood crumpled like paper. The car spun, leaving black marks on the asphalt, and stopped in a ditch. Glenn survived. Danny knew how far he could go, but his ribs were broken, his left arm was dislocated, and his face was covered in glass cuts. He was taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where he spent the night screaming at doctors and lawyers. Jason found out about this from Kevin the next day. He was sitting in his office, looking out over the Chicago River, when Kevin called. Harper is in the hospital, he said, his voice neutral, like a man reporting the weather. The car is in pieces. Insurance is already calling. They say payments are in question because the system has failed. He's furious, Jay. But that's what you wanted, right? Jason nodded. although Kevin couldn't see him. "Yes," he said. His voice was cold, but something inside cracked. He pictured Glenn in the hospital room, his smug smile replaced by a grimace of pain, and felt nothing, only the emptiness that grew with every step of his revenge. The police didn't dig deep. Glenn was known for his enemies' competitors, deceived investors, jilted lovers. When detectives reviewed the camera footage, they found only the shadow of a hooded figure glimpsed near the car the day before the accident. The case was classified as possible vandalism and sent to the archives. Glenn's reputation and his habit of playing with fire made him an easy target for the indifference of the cops. No one wanted to save a man who was digging his own hole. Jason watched from afar, like a general watching a battlefield. He met Kevin at the same bar, listened to the reports, nodded when Lucas told how Glenn yelled at the mechanics, or when Mike laughed, describing his face covered in paint. Each strike was precise, calculated, just like in the old days when they planned operations in the desert. But with every blow, Jason felt something inside him die. He looked in the mirror and saw a man he did not recognize, not a journalist, not a father, but an avenger whose soul was becoming darker. He sat in his office, looking at the photo of Nathan and Olivia, the only one left on the table. They hadn't called since they left, and their silence was like a knife, cutting deeper than Elizabeth's betrayal. He destroyed Glenn, but it didn't bring his children back. It didn't bring his life back. His smile, cold and gloomy, was a mask behind which there was an emptiness, and he knew that this campaign, no matter how successful, would not fill it. Jason Crow lived in the shadow of his anger, but even shadows can be weary. The campaign against Glenn Harper brought results. His car was trashed, his reputation was stained, his health was in jeopardy, but every step forward left Jason increasingly empty. Nathan and Olivia grew distant. Their calls became as rare as the winter sun, and the Oak Park house, once full of laughter, was now a mausoleum of their past. Elizabeth disappeared from his life, leaving only a divorce notice and memories of her betrayal. In this vacuum of loneliness, Caitlin Morris, the woman whose pain mirrored his own, became an unexpected beacon, not salvation, but something to remind him of life. Their first meeting after the gala evening happened by chance. Jason walked into a bar called the Rusty Anchor, a nondescript place in the West Loop where no one knew his name and bourbon was cheap enough to drink without worrying about the bill. Caitlin sat in the corner, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun and a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of her. She looked up as he entered, and their gazes met, as if a magnet had drawn them across the smoky hall. Jason froze, remembering her words at the gala. "I know the way you look. I've been where you are now." Then she was warned. Now she was a reflection. He approached without asking permission and sat down opposite. "Caitlin," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue, "I didn't expect you here." She smiled, but her smile was a shadow, as if the joy had long left her. "This is my bar, Jason," she replied, her fingers wrapping around her glass. "Where else can you hide from the world?" They ordered more drinks, and the conversation began slowly, like a river breaking through ice. Caitlin didn't ask about Glenn, didn't mention Elizabeth, and Jason was grateful for that. Instead, they talked about the past, not about marriages, not about betrayals, but about little things. Her love of old vinyl records, his habit of reading newspapers from the back, their shared memories of Chicago in the 90s, when the city seemed simpler. But the pain still seeped into their words like water through cracks. Caitlin talked about her son, who stopped calling after her divorce, and the nights she drank to forget his voice. Jason admitted that he couldn't walk into the bedroom without seeing Elizabeth laughing at his jokes. "We're like two drowning people," Caitlin said, her eyes sparkling with whiskey and something else. "We hold on to the wreckage so as not to sink." Jason nodded, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Only the fragments are getting smaller," he answered, and they laughed, briefly, bitterly, but for the first time in weeks he felt the heaviness in his chest ease slightly. They began to meet regularly, without calling it dates. The Rusty Anchor became their sanctuary where they shared stories they couldn't tell anyone else. Caitlin talked about her years in the clinic, how she learned to live with a feeling of guilt that never went away. Jason talked about Nathan and Olivia, how their silence cut deeper than a knife. They didn't look for answers, they just listened, and that was enough to breathe a little easier. One night, a month after their first meeting, the whiskey flows more freely than usual. The bar was almost empty, except for the bartender wiping down the bar and a couple of regulars whispering in the corner. Jason looked at Caitlin, her face illuminated by the dim lamp, and noticed the wrinkles around her eyes, traces of pain that made her seem real, not like the ghost of Elizabeth that still haunted him. She caught his gaze and smiled, but there was something new in this smile, not just sympathy, but desire, cautious but alive. "Come to me," she said quietly, her hand touching him on the table, light as a feather, but warm. "I don't want to be alone today." Jason froze, his mind screaming that this was a mistake, that he was not ready, that this was not love, not a replacement. But his body, tired of loneliness, wanted warmth, touch, something that would remind him that he was still alive. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and they walked out into the cold Chicago night, their steps quick, as if they were afraid of changing their minds. Her apartment was in an old building in Logan Square, with worn parquet floors and windows overlooking a noisy street. The inside smelled of coffee and lavender, and the walls were covered with black and white photographs Caitlin in her youth, her son, long gone from her life. She poured more whiskey, but they barely sipped it. Their gazes met, and words became unnecessary. Caitlin stepped towards him, her hands touching his face, and Jason felt his walls crumble. It wasn't love. It was not a passion, as in youth, or a promise of a future. It was a comfort, two broken souls looking for a moment of peace. They fell onto her bed, their movements awkward, almost desperate, as if they were trying to drive away the shadows of the past. Caitlin whispered his name, her fingers digging into his shoulders, and Jason closed his eyes, allowing himself to forget, if only for an hour, about Glenn, Elizabeth, the children, about the world that had fallen apart. In the morning, light filtered through the curtains, drawing stripes on her face. Caitlin lay next to her hair scattered across the pillow, and her eyes open, looking at the ceiling. Jason woke up feeling like something had changed, but he couldn't name it. He expected guilt, but there was none, only warmth, fragile, like the first snow, and the fear that it would melt. Caitlin turned to him, her gaze soft but firm. "I don't want to be a backup option, Jason," she said, her voice quiet but honest. "I know you're still there, with her, with them. But I'm here if you decide to move on with your life." He looked at her. Her words were like a mirror, showing his pain, but also his chance. He nodded, at a loss for words, but his hand found hers, squeezing her fingers. For the first time in months, he felt warmth, not fire, not passion, but something calm, like coals that could still flare up. He didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment, in her small apartment, he was not alone, and that was enough. Several months passed, but for Jason Crow, time did not heal, it simply covered the wounds with a crust, under which the pain still smoldered. The campaign against Glenn Harper ended, leaving him broken but not giving Jason back what he had lost. Nathan and Olivia visited rarely, their calls were short, and their glances were full of unspoken reproaches. Elizabeth disappeared from his life after the divorce, lost in rumors of her fall into sterling press and loneliness in expensive hotels. But in that emptiness there was Caitlin Morris, a woman whose pain mirrored his own and whose warmth became his anchor. Their family grew. Nathan and Emma married and had a son, Liam, a boy with Nathan's dark eyes and Emma's smile. Jason looked at his grandson and felt something inside him thaw, not completely, but enough to move on with his life. Olivia remained in California, building a career at a technology company, but she came back for the holidays. Her calls became more frequent, and Jason clung to these moments like a lifeline. Liam's first birthday was a sunny, warm September day. The Evanston house was full of laughter. Nathan was chasing Liam around the garden. Emma was laying out a cake with blue frosting, and Olivia was blowing up balloons, her hair in a high ponytail like when she was a child. Caitlin presided over the chaos, her laughter ringing like a bell, and Jason looked at her, feeling a gratitude he couldn't express in words. This was their new family, fragile but alive, and he almost believed that the past was behind them. but the past never goes away forever. Jason was in the kitchen cutting up watermelon for the kids when he heard a car pull up. He looked out the window and froze. Elizabeth stepped out of the taxi. Her figure was thin, almost ghostly, in a simple gray dress that hung on her like on a coat rack. Her hair, once golden, was dull, tied into a low bun, and her face was pale, with deep wrinkles that had not been there 3 years ago. She looked older, more broken, and Jason felt his heart clench not with love, but with something akin to pity mixed with anger. He went out onto the porch, not letting her get closer to the house. The living room was full of children, their laughter coming through the open windows, and he didn't want this day, this moment, to be ruined. "What are you doing here, Liz?" he asked, his voice as cold as the September wind. "Nobody called you." Elizabeth stopped a few steps away, her hands clutching her purse, her fingers trembling. Her eyes, still blue but dull, met his. "Jason," she said, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. I wanted to see Liam. And you. Please give me a chance." Jason crossed his arms, his jaw clenching. "Chance?" His grin was as sharp as a blade. "You think you can just come here like nothing happened after everything?" She stepped closer, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm lonely, Jay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost everything, my job, my friends, my children. I live in a rented apartment that smells like mold, and every day I think about what I've done. I was stupid, I know, but I still love you. Let's start again. Please." Her words were like an echo of the past, like a song he once knew by heart, but now it sounded false. Jason looked at her, at the woman who was his world, and saw only a shadow, not Liz, not his wife, but a ghost clinging to something that was no longer there. He remembered the gala, her laugh with Glenn, the ring given to another, her message, "I need time." He remembered the pain it left and Caitlin's warmth that helped him survive. "You chose hell, Liz," he said in a voice as hard as granite. "Live in it." Elizabeth gasped, her hand pressed to her chest as if he had hit her. She opened her mouth to say something, but tears flowed and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Jason did not move, his eyes were cold, but something stirred inside, not pity, not guilt, but a shadow of doubt, which he immediately suppressed. He turned and went into the house, closing the door as if he could shut her out forever. The celebration continued. Liam laughed and smeared frosting all over his face. Nathan threw him in the air. Olivia took pictures, and Caitlin hugged Jason, feeling his tension but not asking. He tried to smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere, until an hour later there was a sound that shattered their world. Shot. It was loud, like thunder echoing from the back garden. Jason froze, his heart stopping, and then he rushed to the door, Nathan and Olivia behind him. Caitlin shouted, "Stop!" But he was already outside, his feet carrying him to the backyard, where the apple trees grew and Caitlin's lavender bloomed. Elizabeth was lying on the grass, a small silver pistol lay nearby. Her eyes were open but empty, and her face was calm, as if she had finally found peace. Jason stopped, his breathing coming in ragged gasps, the world around him slowing down. He heard Olivia's cry, sharp, almost animalistic, and the stomping of Nathan, who ran up to the body. "Mother!" Olivia screamed, falling to her knees, her hands shaking, trying to touch Elizabeth, but not daring. "No, no, no." Nathan stood, his face as white as chalk, his fists clenched. "Dad," he managed, his voice hoarse, "what have you done?" Jason didn't answer, his eyes glued to the note sticking out of Elizabeth's pocket. He leaned down, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a piece of paper folded in half. The handwriting was hers, uneven, as if she was writing in a hurry. "I'm sorry, I couldn't take it anymore." The words were simple, but they hit him like a hammer. He looked at the note, at her body, at the blood spreading across the grass, and felt nothing, no anger, no relief, no guilt. Only emptiness, cold and endless, like Lake Michigan in winter. Olivia was sobbing, her face pressed into Caitlin's chest, who ran up and hugged her, her own eyes filled with tears. Nathan turned to Jason, his gaze full of pain and accusation. "You turned her down, Dad," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "She came for help, and you told her to live in hell." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He wanted to say that she herself chose this path, that her betrayal destroyed them all, that he could not forgive. But looking at Nathan, at Olivia, at their tears, he realized that they saw not her guilt, but his cruelty. They blamed him not for the shot, but for the words that might have driven her to him. The neighbors called the police, and soon the garden was filled with flashing lights, the voices of cops, and the rustle of walkie-talkies. The detective, an older man with tired eyes, took the note, examined the body, and nodded to Jason, as if suicide were a routine matter. "We'll figure it out," he said, "but it looks like she did it herself." Jason nodded, his movements mechanical. He watched as Elizabeth's body was carried away, as Nathan and Olivia stood to the side, their faces masks of shock and grief. Caitlin touched his hand, her fingers were warm, but he could barely feel them. He knew he had to say something, do something, but the emptiness swallowed everything. The holiday ended, Liam slept in his room, not knowing that his grandmother was gone forever. Nathan and Olivia gathered their things, their silence louder than any words. As they drove away, Olivia looked at Jason, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something else, a distance he couldn't overcome. "We'll call Dad," she said, but her voice was empty, like her promise. The rain began before dawn, gray and stubborn, as if the sky had decided to mourn Elizabeth Crow before the people did. Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, with its old oak trees and marble angels, was shrouded in a veil of drizzle that drowned out everything except the rustling of umbrellas and quiet sobs. Jason Crow stood to the side, under the bare branches of a maple tree. His black cloak was soaked through, but he did not notice the cold. His eyes were glued to the coffin, dark, lacquered, with a single white rose lying on top, which was slowly being lowered into the ground. This was the last act of her life, and he felt that he should be here, but did not know who husband, enemy, or just a witness. The funeral was modest, almost rushed, as if no one wanted to linger in this moment longer than necessary. Nathan and Olivia stood by the grave, their faces pale, their eyes red from the tears they were trying to hold back. Emma held Nathan's hand. Her umbrella protected them both, but could not hide them from the pain. Olivia was alone, her hair stuck to her cheeks, and her fingers clutching a handkerchief, which she fiddled with until it turned into a lump. They organized everything, the ceremony, the priest, even the rose, because there was no one to bury Elizabeth but them. Her friends from Sterling Press turned away long ago. Her family was far away, and lovers like Glenn Harper had disappeared like smoke. Only the children remained to say goodbye, and Jason, who couldn't bring himself to come closer. He chose a place to the side, outside the circle of mourners. There were few of them, no more than a dozen. A couple of distant relatives, a neighbor from her last home, a priest whose voice trembled in the rain. Jason didn't want their attention, didn't want their questions or sympathy. He came not for them, but for himself, to see the end, to make sure that this chapter of his life was closed forever. But standing in the rain, feeling the water running down his face, he wasn't sure he was ready for this. Nathan noticed him first. His gaze, full of pain and anger, slid across the crowd and settled on Jason, standing alone by a tree. He frowned, his jaw clenching as if he wanted to shout, to call, but instead he turned away, his shoulders slumping. Olivia looked after her, her eyes wide open, full of tears and something else, hope, which immediately faded when she realized that he would not come. They were looking for him, their father, the man who was supposed to be there, to hold their hands, to share their grief. But Jason remained where he was, his feet rooted to the ground and his heart too heavy to move. Chicago has never changed. Its skyscrapers shone like diamonds, its streets buzzed with ambition, and its balls were like those held in a hotel. Drake in the Fall were the arena where the rich and beautiful played their games. Jason Crow knew this scene all too well. Next to him was Caitlin, whose hand lay on his elbow, warm and confident, like a beacon in a storm. The charity ball was dedicated to the fight against cancer, but Jason knew that behind the facade of virtue, the same intrigues were hidden: deals, flirting, betrayals. He didn't want to come, but Caitlin insisted. "We're not hiding, Jay," she said, her eyes sparkling with determination. "This is our city, our life. Let them see that we are stronger." She was right, as always. Jason wore a black tuxedo, the same one he wore at their wedding, and Caitlin chose a midnight-colored dress, highlighting her dark hair and quiet strength. They entered the hall together, their steps were synchronized, and Jason felt the guests' gazes sliding over them, curious, appraising, but not hostile. He was no longer a broken husband to be pitied. He was Jason Crow, the man who lived. The hall was shining. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections, the orchestra played something soft, almost hypnotic, and the waiters served champagne in glasses as thin as promises. Jason and Caitlin found a table by the window overlooking Lake Michigan, and he allowed himself to relax, listening to her light laugh as she commented on someone's ridiculous dress. But his eyes, accustomed to looking for a threat, slid over the crowd, and he saw him. Glenn Harper. He was there, like a shark returning to familiar waters. His suit was impeccable, his hair was slicked back, and his smile was still the same, predatory as 4 years ago. He had recovered from the accident, from the hospital, from the humiliation that Jason's friends had inflicted, but his gaze was as tenacious, as if he was looking for new prey. Jason felt his fingers curl into fists, but Caitlin touched his arm. "Don't, Jay," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "He's not worth it." Jason nodded, but his eyes never left Glenn. He saw him approach a young woman in a blue dress, tall, with brown curls and a nervous smile. She was about 30, with a wedding ring shining on her finger, and a man next to her, her husband, judging by the way he held her waist. Glenn leaned toward her, his hand sliding over her elbow, and she laughed, but there was an awkwardness in her laugh, as if she felt trapped but didn't know how to escape. Jason stood up, his movement slow but decisive. "I have to," he told Caitlin, his voice low, almost a growl. She looked at him, her eyes full of worry, but she nodded, knowing that it was impossible to stop him. He approached the group, where Glenn was already whispering something to the woman. His smile was like poison, sweet and deadly. The husband, a strong man with a short beard, stood to the side, talking to someone, but his gaze kept returning to his wife. Jason stood nearby, his presence like a shadow falling across their stage. "Can I talk to you?" he said, turning to his husband. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The husband turned, his eyebrows raised, but he nodded, taking a couple of steps away with Jason. "Do you know this person?" Jason asked, nodding towards Glenn, who was now holding a glass of champagne, bringing it to the woman's lips. "He's flirting with your wife." The husband frowned, his eyes narrowed. "It's just a conversation," he said, but his tone was hesitant, as if he was trying to convince himself. Jason pulled out his phone, his fingers quickly finding a photo, an old one, but one he kept as a reminder. It was Elizabeth, photographed by reporters after her suicide, her face pale, empty, against the backdrop of flashing police lights. He showed the screen to his husband, his voice as cold as ice. "This is what he does to families. His name is Glenn Harper. He seduces women, destroys marriages, and leaves only pain. My wife, she was one of them. She didn't survive." The husband turned pale, and his eyes widened as he looked at the photo, then at Glenn, then at his wife. His jaw clenched, and he stepped back, his hand resting on the woman's shoulder. "Hey, Laura," he said, his voice tense. "We need to go." Laura turned around, her smile fading when she saw her husband's face. "What happened, Mike?" she asked, but her eyes fell on Jason, who was standing with the phone, and on Glenn, whose smile had become strained. Mike showed her the photo, his voice hoarse. "He did it. With him. Do you know who he is?" Laura looked at the screen, her hand pressed to her lips, her eyes filled with horror. She turned to Glenn, her face contorted with anger. You're a monster," she blurted out, and her hand flew up, hitting him in the face with such force that the sound echoed throughout the hall. Glenn stumbled back, his cheek turning red. The glass fell from his hand, breaking on the parquet floor. The hall fell silent, the guests' eyes turned towards them like spotlights. Glenn straightened up, his eyes burning, but he didn't have time to say anything. Jason stepped forward, his fist connecting with Glenn's jaw with a dull crunch, sending him crashing to the floor. "This is for her," he said. His voice was quiet, but every word was like a shot. "And for everyone you destroyed." Caitlin ran up, her hand landing on Jason's shoulder, stopping him from striking him a second time. "That's enough, Jay," she whispered, her eyes full of anxiety, but also pride. Mike hugged Laura, leading her away, their faces a mixture of shock and gratitude. Glenn was lying on the floor, his suit was wrinkled, blood was flowing from the corner of his mouth, and his gaze full of hatred was fixed on Jason. Photographers Harold, Jason's old colleagues, were right there, their flashes capturing every moment. Laura's slap, Jason's punch, Glenn's fall. Jason knew it would end up in the newspaper and didn't try to stop them. Let the world see. Let Glenn feel what it's like to be exposed. The next day, Chicago Herald came out with a headline on the front page, "Demolition Broker, the Truth About Glenn Harper." The article, written by a young reporter under the mentorship of his old friend Jason, was merciless. Names, dates, testimonies of victims, women whose marriages he destroyed, men whose lives he destroyed. There was Elizabeth's story, her tragedy, her end, and dozens of others, compiled by the private investigator Jason had hired years ago. The article called Glenn a predator whose broker's license was hanging in the balance and his reputation in tatters. By midday, his firm had announced its layoffs, the stock exchange board had launched an investigation, and clients had fled like rats from a sinking ship. Jason read the newspaper over breakfast while sitting with Caitlin in their Evanston kitchen. She silently poured him coffee, her hand touched his shoulder, and he felt her support, her understanding. "You did it, Jay," she said quietly. "For her. For all of them." He nodded, but his smile was bitter. The victory did not bring joy, only fatigue. Glenn was defeated, but it didn't bring Elizabeth back. It didn't heal Nathan and Olivia. It didn't fill the emptiness he carried within himself. He looked at the headline, at the photo of Glenn lying on the floor, and thought that this was the end or should be. But Chicago doesn't forgive the weak. 2 days later, Glenn was found in an alley behind an abandoned warehouse on the south side, his body mutilated, his face unrecognizable. The police called it a robbery, but Jason knew the truth. Someone, maybe the husband of one of his victims, maybe a former client, maybe just a shadow of his past, has finished what he started. Kevin called him with the news, his voice neutral as always. "He got his, Jay. This is the end." Jason stood on the porch, looking out over Caitlin's lavender garden. He felt no triumph, no guilt, only silence, as if the city had finally fallen silent. Glenn was dead, Elizabeth was in the past, and he was alive, with Caitlin, with a chance he almost didn't deserve. He turned and walked into the house, closing the door behind him as if he could leave it all behind. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.